One gunshot, one soldier dead in the dust, and one stray dog sprinting across an invisible line in the mountains, dragging two nations to the edge of war. In October of 1925, Greece and Bulgaria were tired countries with raw nerves and fresh graves. They had survived the collapse of empires, the shock of new borders, waves of refugees, and the bitter aftertaste of defeat and humiliation. They were not looking for another fight. And yet, for a few days, a single border incident lit the fuse so fast that diplomats in Europe barely had time to sit down before the Balkans threatened to explode again. People still remember it with a half-smile as the War of the Stray Dog. It sounds like a joke, like a footnote, like something too absurd to be real. But when you strip away the nickname, you find something far more dangerous. A region where a line on a map could be worth a life. A region where pride could outrun reason. And a moment where a minor tragedy nearly became a major catastrophe, because everyone involved believed they could not afford to look weak. To understand how this happened, you have to go to the border itself. Not the border in a treaty, the border on the ground, a place of pine forests and rocky slopes, of cold mornings where the fog sits low and the silence feels like a warning, a place where a patrol could walk for hours and see nothing, and then suddenly see everything all at once, in the shape of a shadow between trees, a movement in tall grass, a flash of metal. In 1925, this frontier between Greece and Bulgaria was more than geography. It was memory. It was resentment. It was fear. And it was crowded. After the First World War, the Balkans had been rearranged like furniture in a room that never truly belonged to anyone. Borders shifted. Populations shifted with them, sometimes by choice, more often by force. Villages changed language overnight. Families who had lived on the same land for generations packed what they could carry and left behind what they couldn't. Greece, in particular, was still bleeding from a disaster that had shaken it to the core. Just 3 years earlier, in 1922, the Greek campaign in Asia Minor had collapsed. The dream of expanding into Anatolia ended in flames. Smyrna burned. Hundreds of thousands fled. 1 million or more refugees poured into Greece, bringing trauma, hunger, and a desperate need for shelter. The country was overwhelmed. The economy strained. Politics turned poisonous. And in that chaos, a man rose to power who believed Greece needed discipline, strength, and a firm hand on the wheel. His name was Theodoros Pangalos. Pangalos was a soldier first, a politician second, and a Democrat only when it suited him. He had fought in wars that seemed never-ending. He had watched governments fall and armies retreat. He had seen what humiliation did to a nation's soul, and he loathed it. In June 1925, he seized power in a coup. He promised order. He promised national dignity. And like many men who promised dignity, he was quick to take offense. Across the border, Bulgaria had its own wounds. It had lost territory after the Great War. It had been forced to accept terms that many Bulgarians considered unfair and degrading. Its politics were unstable, its society tense. And along its borders, armed groups sometimes operated in the shadows: revolutionaries, nationalists, men with old grudges and new weapons. The region was full of people who had learned to survive by carrying a rifle and trusting no one. So when you put two anxious nations face to face in a mountain pass, you don't need much to start a fire. You only need a spark. The story begins in the area near Petrich, a Bulgarian town not far from the Greek border. It's a place where the hills seem to fold into each other, where a line drawn by diplomats can cut across paths that shepherds have used for centuries. On the Greek side, soldiers stood watch in small outposts. Their job was simple: protect the border. But the reality was not simple at all, because the border wasn't just a border. It was a wound, and it hurt. There are different versions of what happened next, and that alone tells you something important. When history is calm, people agree on details. When history is angry, details become weapons. One widely repeated account says a Greek soldier was walking his post with a dog, a stray, or perhaps a camp dog that had attached itself to the men like so many animals do in wartime, hungry, loyal, half-wild, living off scraps and kindness. The dog bolted. Maybe it smelled something. Maybe it heard a sound. Maybe it simply saw freedom in the trees and ran. The soldier, without thinking, chased after it, and in a heartbeat, he crossed the border. It's easy to picture it as a harmless moment. A tired young man trying to retrieve a dog before it vanished into the woods, a small laugh among comrades, a story to tell later. But the border was not a place for harmless moments. Somewhere nearby, Bulgarian guards saw movement, a figure crossing into their territory. In places like this, you are trained to assume the worst, to see an intruder, not a neighbor, a threat, not a mistake. A shot rang out, and the Greek soldier fell. In another version, the Greek soldier wasn't chasing a dog at all. He was part of a patrol, and a confrontation broke out. Words were exchanged, tempers flared. Someone fired first. Or someone thought someone fired first. And then there is the version that says the soldier was not simply shot, but killed in a sudden burst of violence that felt like an ambush. The truth may be lost in the fog of that border morning. But the result was clear enough. A Greek soldier was dead, and the men who found his body did not see an accident. They saw an insult. You have to understand what that meant in 1925. These were societies where the uniform mattered, where the army was not just an institution, but a symbol of survival. Greece had been humiliated recently. Bulgaria had been humiliated too. Both were sensitive to the idea that the other might be testing them. A death on the border could be mourned quietly, or it could be turned into a message. In Athens, the news hit like a slap. Pangalos and his government demanded satisfaction. They demanded an apology. They demanded punishment for those responsible. They demanded compensation. And they demanded it fast. Because speed itself was part of the message. The Greek leadership framed it not as a tragic misunderstanding, but as a deliberate act, a violation that proved Bulgaria could not be trusted. They argued that if Greece did not respond forcefully, it would invite more attacks, more humiliation, more blood. In Sofia, Bulgaria's leaders were horrified and defensive. From their point of view, a Greek soldier had crossed the border. Their guards had reacted, perhaps too harshly, yes, but in a tense frontier zone, mistakes happened. And Bulgaria had no desire to fight Greece. It could barely afford stability, let alone war. But there was a problem. If Bulgaria apologized too deeply, if it paid too much, if it accepted blame too easily, it would look weak to its own people. It would look like a nation that could be pushed around. And in the Balkans of the 1920s, weakness was an invitation. So Bulgaria hesitated. It offered talks. It offered an investigation. It tried to slow the crisis down. Greece accelerated it. Pangalos issued an ultimatum. The exact terms have been argued over, but the spirit of it was unmistakable. Greece demanded an official apology, punishment of those responsible, and a financial indemnity. And if Bulgaria did not comply quickly, Greece would take action. Now imagine the men on the ground during those hours. Young soldiers in rough uniforms, standing in cold air with rifles that had seen too many hands, listening to rumors, hearing that a comrade had been killed, hearing that war might be coming. Some of them had already fought in recent conflicts. Some were refugees themselves, men who had lost homes and family in the chaos of the early 1920s. Some were barely old enough to shave. And now they were being told to look across the trees and see an enemy. On October 22, 1925, Greece acted. Greek forces crossed into Bulgaria near Petrich. The War of the Stray Dog was no longer a joke. It was an invasion. The Greek troops moved quickly, pressing toward the town. The aim, Greece claimed, was limited: to secure the area, to punish those responsible, to force Bulgaria to comply. But even a limited invasion is still an invasion to the people living under it. Bulgarian units and local defenders resisted. Shots cracked across fields. Machine guns rattled in bursts that turned panic into chaos. And civilians, always the civilians, were caught in the middle. Families in villages near the fighting didn't care about ultimatums and indemnities. They cared about whether a stray bullet would punch through a wall. They cared about whether their children could run fast enough if the shooting came closer. They cared about whether the next soldier they saw would demand food or take it. In Petrich, the tension was suffocating. People listened for the sound of boots, for the distant thunder of artillery, for any clue about what kind of day it would be. And here is one of the little-known details that makes this crisis even more unsettling. Bulgaria, aware that it was militarily vulnerable and terrified of a wider war, reportedly instructed its forces to avoid escalating the conflict as much as possible. In some accounts, Bulgarian regular troops were told to pull back, to resist but not to provoke, to avoid giving Greece an excuse to widen the invasion. That meant local militia and irregular defenders sometimes bore the brunt of the fighting. It's a chilling dynamic. A government trying to keep a war from becoming a war, while people on the ground are already dying. Greek forces advanced. Skirmishes multiplied. The death toll rose. The numbers were not enormous compared to the horrors the Balkans had seen before, but that's the point. It didn't take enormous numbers to create enormous danger, because every death created pressure for revenge. Every funeral created anger. Every angry headline made compromise harder. And the Balkans had a habit by then of turning small conflicts into chain reactions. In Athens, Pangalos was not merely responding to the border incident. He was performing strength. He was showing Greece and the world that the country would not be pushed. In Sofia, Bulgarian leaders faced a nightmare choice: resist and risk a larger war they could hardly win, or concede and risk political humiliation at home. And beyond both capitals, the rest of Europe watched with a familiar dread. This was supposed to be the post-war era, the age of diplomacy, the age of the League of Nations, the great experiment meant to prevent exactly this kind of escalation. The League had been created with lofty promises: collective security, peaceful resolution, international cooperation. But by 1925, many people already suspected it was a beautiful idea built on fragile foundations. Now, on a cold border in the Balkans, the League's credibility was about to be tested. Bulgaria appealed to the League of Nations. It was a strategic move, and a desperate one. Bulgaria wanted international pressure to stop Greece. It wanted the world to see it as the victim of aggression rather than the instigator of violence. And for the League, this was a moment of truth. Could it restrain a member state from military action? Could it act quickly enough to matter? Could it prevent a local clash from becoming a regional war? Because if it couldn't, then what was it for? The League moved faster than many expected. It called for a ceasefire. It demanded that Greek forces withdraw from Bulgarian territory. It proposed an investigation into the incident and a process for compensation. Greece, however, did not immediately comply. Pangalos argued that Greece had been wronged, that Bulgaria had failed to act, that Greece had the right to defend itself and to secure justice. And in the background, there was another calculation. If Greece could achieve its objectives quickly, if it could occupy territory, impose terms, and withdraw on its own schedule, it could claim victory. It could claim strength. But the longer it stayed, the more it would look like an aggressor, and the more likely it was that other powers would step in, not with sympathy, but with pressure. Europe in the 1920s was a web of alliances, fears, and unresolved disputes. No one wanted the Balkans to ignite again. Not because they loved peace, but because they feared where another Balkan conflict might lead. The last time the region had spiraled out of control, it had helped pull the world into a catastrophe. So the pressure on Greece intensified. Diplomats leaned in. Messages were sent. Warnings were delivered in formal language that barely concealed the meaning. Stop, or you will stand alone. Greek troops remained in parts of Bulgaria for several days. Fighting continued in pockets, and people kept dying in a war that, officially, neither side wanted. Then, under mounting international pressure, Greece agreed to withdraw. The ceasefire held. And just like that, the war ended almost as quickly as it began. But endings are rarely clean. The League of Nations investigated and ruled in a way that surprised some observers. Greece, as the invading party, was required to pay compensation to Bulgaria. Not Bulgaria paying Greece. Greece paying Bulgaria. The amount was significant for the time, and the decision carried a message. Crossing a border with troops, even in response to a provocation, was unacceptable. To Greece, especially to Pangalos and his supporters, it felt like humiliation, like being punished for defending national honor. To Bulgaria, it was vindication, but also a reminder of how close it had come to disaster. And to the League of Nations, it was a rare moment where it seemed to work. A small war was stopped. A larger war was avoided. Diplomacy, for once, outpaced the gun. But even that success came with questions, because the League's authority depended on the willingness of states to obey. It had no army of its own, no direct enforcement mechanism. Its power was, in many ways, the power of reputation and collective pressure. And reputation can be fragile. In later years, the League would fail to prevent other aggressions, far larger, far more consequential. And those failures would make people look back at 1925 not as proof of strength, but as a brief moment when the system still had enough legitimacy to function. A moment before the world learned, again, how easily legitimacy can evaporate. Still, to call this episode The War of the Stray Dog is to miss what it reveals about human nature and political nature. Because this was never just about a dog. It was about a border drawn through contested land and contested memory. It was about two nations carrying humiliation like a stone in the chest. It was about leaders who believed that backing down was more dangerous than charging forward. It was about soldiers trained to react in seconds, while diplomats needed days. Think about the first man who died. We don't always remember his name. We don't always remember his face. History often preserves generals and prime ministers while forgetting the private who bleeds first. But he mattered. He was someone's son, someone's friend, someone who woke up that morning expecting another routine day of boredom and vigilance. Someone who, for a few seconds, was not thinking about geopolitics at all, only about a dog running into the trees. And then he was gone. That is how quickly the world can change at a border. And think about the men who fired. Were they monsters? Or were they scared, tense, trained to treat movement as danger? Did they know they were pulling a trigger that would echo all the way to Athens and Sofia, and then to Geneva, where the League sat trying to keep the world stitched together? Probably not. History is full of moments where ordinary people do something ordinary. Chase a dog, shout a warning, raise a rifle, and the consequences become extraordinary. And think about Pangalos. He wanted to look strong. He wanted to prove Greece would not be humiliated again. In a sense, he was speaking to the ghosts of 1922, to the refugees sleeping in makeshift shelters, to the veterans who felt their sacrifices had been mocked by defeat. But strength performed for an audience can become a trap, because once you perform it, you have to keep performing it. You have to escalate. You have to refuse compromise. Otherwise, the audience turns on you. In the end, Greece withdrew and paid compensation anyway. The show of force did not produce the clean victory Pangalos imagined. It produced international condemnation and a bill. And his own political fate would not be stable. Within a year, Pangalos would be overthrown. The man who seized power promising order would be swept aside by the same turbulence he claimed he could control. The border incident faded into history, and the nickname stuck. The War of the Stray Dog. A phrase that makes people smile until they realize what it really means. It means a war can start for reasons that sound ridiculous only because we refuse to admit how fragile peace really is. Because the truth is, wars rarely begin with grand speeches and marching bands. They begin with misunderstandings, with fear, with pride, with a single gunshot that nobody can take back. They begin when leaders decide that appearing weak is worse than spilling blood. And they begin when institutions designed to prevent war are forced to prove their worth in real time, under real pressure, with real lives hanging in the balance. There's another unsettling layer here, one that feels uncomfortably modern. In 1925, information moved fast enough to inflame, but not fast enough to clarify. Rumors outran facts. Newspapers amplified outrage. Governments acted on partial reports. The public demanded action before anyone truly understood what had happened in the forest. Today, information moves instantly. Outrage moves even faster. And borders, whether physical or political, are still places where a small incident can be magnified into a crisis. A patrol fires. A drone crosses a line. A single death becomes a symbol. A symbol becomes a demand. A demand becomes an ultimatum. And suddenly, the world is holding its breath again, wondering if this is the moment everything tips. The War of the Stray Dog is not important because it was large. It's important because it was small. It shows how quickly a minor incident can become a test of national pride. How easily leaders can confuse vengeance with justice. How fragile peace becomes when societies are wounded and afraid. And how desperately the world needs mechanisms, imperfect, flawed, but real, to slow the rush toward violence. In 1925, the Balkans stepped to the edge and looked down. For a few days, it seemed like they might fall. They didn't. Not because the region suddenly became wise, not because hatred vanished, not because the border stopped being tense. They didn't fall because pressure, diplomacy, and the fear of wider consequences pulled them back. And because, perhaps, enough people on both sides understood a quiet truth, that no indemnity is worth a life. No apology can resurrect the dead, and no nation, however proud, can shoot its way out of grief. A dog ran across a border. A man followed. A gun fired. And the Balkans nearly burned again. If that doesn't make you rethink what we call a small incident, then nothing will. Because history is not only shaped by grand plans, it is shaped by moments, by reflexes, by pride, by fear, and sometimes by a stray dog disappearing into the trees, while the world's leaders scrambled to keep the peace from vanishing with it.
If you liked this video, please hit the like and subscribe button for more.